Thank you very much. My name is Hassan Kara. I'm with the LUMS History Group. It is a great pleasure for me to be introducing today's keynote speaker, Professor James Wescoat, who is an Agathon professor in the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT. Professor Wescoat's research concentrates on water systems in South Asia and the United States, from the site to river basin scales. At the site scale, he led the Smithsonian Institute's project titled Garden, City and Empire, Historical Geography of Mughal Lahore, which resulted in co-edited volumes with colleagues from the University of Engineering and Technology, Lahore. These and related books won awards from the Government of Pakistan and Allama Iqbal Awards from the Government of Punjab. At the larger scale, Professor Wescoat has conducted water policy research in the Indus, Colorado, Ganges, and Great Lakes Basin. He co-authored Water for Life, Water Management and Environmental Policy with geographer Gilbert F. White. This was published by Cambridge University Press. He led a US EPA-funded study of potential climate impacts in the Indus River Basin in Pakistan with the Water and Power Development Authority, WAPDA, and contributed to a World Bank involved study, the Indus Basin of Pakistan, the impacts of climate risks in water and agriculture, 2013. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wescoat.
Thank you very much, and thank you, friends, for this invitation to come and speak here today at the Indus Conference, History and the Future. And I'd like to try to link them, building upon the conversation that just took place in the panel. The one thing that will be crucial will be the slides and the lights to be as low as possible, because I'm going to try to include some imagery of gardens that I hope you'll find visually really quite moving. So if the folks can drop the lights. Oh, okay. Well, let me just start then with some of the introductory comments while the projector is warming up. I've been working now, looking back, maybe 25, 30 years on the aspects of the Indus River Basin, and partly in comparison with other rivers around the world. And about 5 years ago, I started to come to think that a new or different approach might be useful to complement the ones that are currently being considered and employed. And this I've called thinking about the Indus River Basin as a garden. And I was able to write one short essay on this subject that's shown on the left-hand side here, that took a very long view of the Indus Basin, and it's, I'm going to call it vegetation history, from the archaeobotany of the Harappan period up to more contemporary irrigation agriculture in the late 20th century. In this latter period, the more recent history of the late 20th century, it came to my mind that there were a number of common perspectives that have developed from the 50s onwards. And so the term Indus waters we're familiar with from the treaty, but it was in more widespread use as well. The Indus was called a food machine in the 60s. The Indus Basin irrigation system, IBIS, another broad concept used in a lot of the modeling work. The Integrated Water Resources Management Framework, which is developed and is currently still developing and widely applied. And then more recently, the idea of a water-energy-food nexus, a water-energy-food-climate nexus, as yet another framework. And all of them in the midst of discussion and debate on questions of governance, political economy, and political ecology. And still it came to my mind that something may be missing. And this is where this idea, well, what if one were to think about the Indus, in addition to thinking of it as a call it food production region, in addition to thinking of it as a system, in addition to thinking of it as a territory or a political economic region, to also think about it as a garden and to draw upon the extraordinary history of gardens, the history and culture of gardens in this region. So the paper has 4 sections that will seek to make the case that this is both an historically guided idea, drawing upon historical precedents of ways of thinking about gardens that I think will have some relevance, but it also has some prospects for new ways of thinking about possible futures for the Indus. The 4 sections will be the Mughal. I'll spend the most time on that, a little bit on the colonial period, a little bit on the late 20th century, and then move into a conclusion on ways of thinking about gardens in the early 21st century of the Indus. So first, the early Mughal gardens of this region, and really from the outset of the Mughal period and of Babur's movement across the Punjab toward Agra in 1927. The construction of gardens were quite crucial. Everywhere they stopped, bringing this tradition from Samarkand and Kabul and Herat. Modest places like Kalar Kahar, the Salt Range, which you see in the upper right-hand part of the slide. And then also in Humayun's period, shortly after the Kamran's Baradari, what's on the banks of the Ravi, now in the middle of the river. On the one hand, you have at the Kalar Kahar, a place that was meant for the experience of orchards surrounding a small water body. In the other case, in Kamran's Baradari, some of its historical records indicate a place of, call it political and family struggles, of betrayal, one brother by another, a son by a father, some of these captured in paintings, others in text. But it gives a sense of the range of meanings of gardens, some of them quite inspiring and beautiful, others of them more cautionary and disturbing. Also important in the history of gardens from the Mughal period is the ways in which they were understood as significant at multiple scales. From the scale of the garden itself, as in this picture of Babur Lane at the Baghiwafa garden outside of Jalalabad on the Kabul River tributary to the Indus, to the idea that cities could be seen as gardens, regions could be seen as gardens, and even the larger kingdom or empire itself as a garden. And when the empire started to consolidate and expand late 16th century, the formation of provinces, they called subas in the Mughal period, began to take shape. And this map that is derived from Professor Irfan Habib at Aligarh Muslim University indicates the provinces of subas associated with what we would now call the Indus River Basin. And we see a conformity from Kashmir to Lahore to Multan down to the Tata subas as very much conforming with some of the territorial structures of the present day. Interestingly, if you map the revenues from the Mughal period, and we've talked about colonial revenues, what I'm really hoping to do is frame this with a pre-colonial context that helps us to think about some of the same questions, but with an earlier set of sources and ideas and inspiration. The revenues are also concentrated in the case of Lahore Suba in the Lahore Tehsil itself, and then somewhat tapering off westward, and then certainly to the south in Sindh and Afghanistan having very small sources of income associated with them. As we look and see what kind of a agrarian system was this, it was a case of a society enormously dependent upon agricultural production, far more so than today, with 2/3 of what was an analogy to a GNP from agricultural sources, mainly from well water and irrigation, inundation canal irrigation. Population was 85% rural at that time. Land revenue tax was tough. 50% of gross production was taken by the state. And the cultivator also had to face all kinds of additional claims upon the remaining 50%, from local zamindars, rich peasants, marauding types of groups coming through for which they were supposed to be protected, but weren't always. And so the types of imagery of garden and agricultural work reflect some of that combination of struggle as well as bounty and productivity in the region. This image in the right-hand slide indicates that to some extent. I hope that the paintings are visible. Are they okay? That's okay, okay, because without that kind of imagery, it's hard to imagine the period that I'm speaking about. And it's at this time that, at least to my knowledge, we have one of the first detailed maps of the Indus River Basin produced in the Mughal period in late 17th century or early 18th. This image on the left of a Mughal map of the Indus River and its tributaries. And I'll point out that the river is running like this, the tributaries flowing into it give an indication of the river and its tributaries, not its boundaries. But it's not mainly about the river as a water resources system. The river at that time was more related to navigation and mobility, the challenges of bridging and transport and crossings and fords. These were the key issues. But there were other painted maps, and the one Mughal map that's a painted image of a canal in the Delhi area had a depiction of the landscape along that canal and the types of productive uses of water that could come from irrigation channels that were developing at this time. So we do have nascent irrigation agriculture, and depicted in the imagery of gardens and fields of the sort that would resonate with the historic images of gardens produced by the Mughals themselves. This map is, again, from Habib's atlas, but it shows some of the canal irrigation developed by the Sultanate and Mughal rulers. The most famous of them is the West Jumna Canal and Shah Jahan's extension of that. But there were also the Shah Jahan Shahnair Canal in Lahore here, the Zirhan Canal up in Ahmedabad area, as well, and others in southern Punjab as well. Largely, though, it's a story of extensive well irrigation, and well irrigation that was very widely respected by the British when they first came in. I should also point out that the paintings on the right show that the rivers at this time were painted and depicted as teeming with life. The images of dolphins, of gar and makara and water amphibians and aquatic birds, just really an extraordinary representation of waters as not just physical phenomena, but also ecological ones as well. What happens in the late 16th century in terms of mobile garden activity is a shift from the historic capitals in Agra and Delhi up into the Lahore region and more broadly Lahore, Kashmir, and Kabul. And so much of the garden references of this period and shortly after coming to concentrate in what we would call the middle and upper Indus. And this is just a chart that shows with the time across the x-axis and the regions or subas along the y-axis, how there's a shift from Agra and Delhi, an interim period of administrative reforms, and then a major shift of garden-related activities and waterworks construction and references that shifts up northwestward in that late 16th century, and it comes to help define what the mobile conception of gardens was all about. And the model here is, of course, Kashmir. Kashmir came to be regarded explicitly in Akbar's texts as a garden. This is a garden region. And it was a place of many gardens along the Lake Dal, yes, but also the headwaters of the Jhelum River, and therefore a way of thinking about the headwaters, one branch of the headwaters of the Indus River as a regional scale garden. So we have all of Hindustan being described as a garden by some of the Mughal rulers. Kashmir is a regional garden, and then Lahore here is being described as a Mughal city of gardens, and fed, at least from the time of Shah Jahan's reign, by the regional Shah Canal, which is feeding Shalimar Bagh, and then being extended through the city, its western suburbs at least, later on, and passing by Myanmar complex as we know today. Let's see if I can advance. Okay, so in the representation of this landscape, this region, we have a number of Mughal paintings that I think give us a set of insights into what the term garden means for different parts of Mughal culture. This is a painting of Shah Jahan hunting with his sons. And the area, though, that I want to draw attention to is in the background of the painting, and we'll expand that detail here to show how much of an agrarian landscape it's representing, with the Persian wheel and nicely cultivated and enclosed garden spaces here, an inclined ramp and canal drawn by bullocks and the water lifters here, and a small gardener working along the channel. And in close detail, you would see him working with a spade and selecting, identifying some of the flowers that are to be cut for some purpose in that channel, which is just a small image of the larger painting, the imperial subject of which is one of, I call it the kind of symbolic and ritual significance of hunting for Mughal culture, but the background being an agrarian landscape that is shown with a lot of dignity and a lot of character, albeit in a very much a secondary portion of the painting. And the reason I think this is important is because in other paintings that will show gardening at work, in which that gardening is the focus of the painting, we start to get a deeper sense of what this term gardening mean. Not in the imperial sense of the term as a place of territorial control and power, but as a place of order, of beauty, of care, a place of cultivation, a place of bounty, a place in which, when situated in a larger landscape, these enclosed gardens, and there's garden spaces within the city complex in the upper right-hand side of this painting, larger landscapes and riverscapes in which have deep meaning, and it was pointed out by Abubakar that some of the spiritual aspects of the discussion in the last panel weren't touched upon, but in this period and in this set of paintings, we do see the ways in which a riverfront and riverfront gardens had an enormous depth of cultural experience in the local period, whether it's for prayer, whether it's for conversation, and or ablutions, whatever it might be in this painting of Sadi's manuscript. This complements the type of everyday gardening experience that we see in other paintings, particularly in poetic manuscripts. This is one on the left being from the Diwani Anwar. And so that led to an essay that I wrote, again, wanting to contrast the ideals of gardens and some of the realities. So this is a paper titled From the Gardens of the Quran to the Gardens of Lahore. And it attempted to show that if you look at the Quranic references to gardens and to paradise, whether it's paradise gardens at the end of time after the resurrection or the gardens of this world, you get a set of connotations that are sometimes quite different from the historical places that are gardens, say Shalimar Bagh and so on. But then there are other places that are garden-like in their meaning and their character that inspire one in ways that are consonant with those Quranic and other virtues. And those aspects are sometimes found together. And I think in the case of Lahore, the place that comes to mind is the Myanmar complex, with the tomb garden of Mala Shah very close to the Myanmar, and also the tank and pavilion of Nadira Begum in that same area. So that we do have examples of places that have this joint character. So for the Mughal period, I want to establish that there's some very strong sets of garden ideals that are both within the specific sites, but that also scale up to larger cities, regions, and territories in ways that were seen as connected with one another in the Mughal period. Very briefly, on the colonial period, there are a number of additional aspects of gardens and gardenings that are brought into the discourse. And the British carry forward a lot of Mughal practices, including explicitly in this map, mapping out the subas of the Ain Akbari, and they did a lot of analysis of the revenue systems and rates of return from the Mughal sources in devising some of their own institutions and aims. It was quite different from some of their own initiatives. We have on the left-hand side a more detailed representation of the Indus River, its tributaries, and for the first time something approximating a basin-like map. And this is from the expedition of Alexander Burns, who was a surveyor and a spy based in the Kutch region, and in the travels up the Indus River, went up to the court of Ranjit Singh, across into Kabul, Bukhara, and produced this map in 1834. It's one of the earlier representations of what I think can be called the Indus Basin. And subsequently, and much after the development of the Upper Ganga Canal, we start to have very large-scale visions of canal irrigation developing in the Punjab itself, as shown in this back in the 1850s. We also have a set of contributions by the British to garden history. So they're developing their own company bogs that can be called soldier bogs, cantonment gardens, a whole suite of garden types that still exist today, albeit in somewhat, in the case of company bogs, deteriorating state. The images on the right were taken last week in the Saharanpur company bog, and the trees are beautiful and in beautiful condition, but the garden itself is almost like a ghost. 1850s were a time of extraordinary initiative in the field of agro-horticultural experimentation and essays. And the branch of the Agro-Horticultural Society of India in Punjab was very active in the 1850s, right at the time when you start having the canal development happening. There's concurrently development of gardens, and there's also solicitation by Dalhousie at that time to say, send me all the information you can about tree planting in the Punjab and its potential, and arguing for extensive tree plantings along all of the canals and roads. So plantation was a major thrust of the Agro-Horticultural Society, as was both field crops in the agricultural portion of their publication, but also a large emphasis on horticulture at that time, complementary, almost equal weight to field crops, and that's changed over time as the horticultural sector is sort of remains very important, but in scale much smaller than it was at that time. Plant introductions, attempts at looking at higher valued goods like silk production and wool were also part of the scope. The society waxed and waned. In the 60s it kind of had been a little bit quiet, and then it came up again in the 70s, and then I think it was finished shortly after. But it gave a sense of what, how some of these colonial period cultivators were thinking in terms of gardens as well as in terms of agricultural production. Last point on this colonial period is just on how important it is to keep the religious connotations of gardens in mind in that part of society as well, because there were no lack of references to gardens of Eden. And so much so that the Indus was regarded as one of the 4 rivers flowing out of the Garden of Eden. The Basin River was thought by many, and there were attempts to construct maps that would link the Ganges and the Indus to what was thought to be the Garden of Eden in the Mesopotamian region. And that kind of aspiration was reflected also in colonial writing about the cultivation that they were observing at the outset of the period of canal development. So you have one author writing, the style of cultivation was careful generally, and for valuable crops, almost garden-like. The carefulness and husbandry of a very high caliber, almost along the lines of military operations. This is speaking in admiration of the what was observed in the field. And similarly, you have the references to different parts of the Indus as being Eden-like. So Larkana was said to be like a Garden of Eden. And that's a nice thought today, isn't it? That the entire region of Sindh, according to Bartle Freer, and people know Freer Hall from Karachi, he said that the entire province could be turned into a blooming Garden of Eden by capturing and distributing the winter hill torrents, even without need to tap the Indus main stem itself. So these references to the Garden of Eden were associated in particular with irrigation projects as transforming and making the desert bloom as a rose, a biblical phrase, which was invoked all over the world by these, call it European irrigators. And the reclamation ethic, I can tell you in the western United States, was suffused with a religiosity, a belief that this was something noble to be done, something virtuous in spiritual as well as economic terms. As we come into the post-colonial period and start to look at the concepts of the Indus River as reflected in the literatures that have occurred over time. This is a Google Ngram diagram which refers to the use of phrases in books published that have been scanned by Google. So it's not scientific, but it's a very large data set. And the blue line here indicates references to the Indus River. The next most significant passage or phrase is the green line, which refers to references to the Indus Basin. Third line in orange is the Indus waters. Wanted to track that with respect to the treaty. And then the smallest, lowest line here is the Indus River Basin itself. And so it just goes to show, with this peaking in the 60s and 70s of referencing to the Indus Basin, Indus waters, Indus River Basin, how much that period of the 50s, 60s, 70s were formative for the idea of the Indus River as a coherent set of waters that were part of a common whole. It's not an ancient idea, it's one that's in formation, but it's also one, if you look at the downward trajectory, that has not been sustained as a very strong idea. In other words, it's not building, we're not getting new bodies of work on the Indus Basin or Indus River Basin as one might expect. Indus River, yes. At the same time, as the 1860s is happening, you're having new water managers trying out ideas. The idea of the Indus as a food machine. Now, I don't know if people recall that phrase very much, but it was analogous to the Ganges was a water machine. Indus was a food machine. Published, as far as I can tell, for the first time in 1977. And almost immediately after, the literature is focusing on the problems of the machine. The machine has got some problems. It's a food factory, but the food factory could be much more productive, and so on and so forth. And some of the scholars who were very much involved in the early years of IMI were some of those publishing about the Indus food machine. And the problems of salinity, waterlogging, yield gaps, and so on were part of the food machine literature. But that gave way. You don't hear much talk about the Indus as a food machine these days as much as you do of the Indus as a system. For the system, there was an extraordinary body of work in modeling that was initiated in the post-Indus Waters Treaty to understand what would be some of the best investments of resources to improve the agricultural economy of the Indus as a whole, given its complexity and given the challenges that the partition of the waters as well as territory had provoked. And so the World Bank's Indus Basin model went through many iterations, and there was a life-tank study in the 60s. There was an early study that was launched, 3 volumes. The one that the World Bank did with an updated Indus Basin model, 2013, is a more recent, but there were dozens of studies that were meant to guide investment planning in the Indus Basin. Not too many of these have references to gardens, I'm sorry to say, but they could have. And there were a number of studies that were concurrent with those modeling ones that were looking more in policy terms, management terms. This one on the Indus water economy that John Briscoe and Usman Qamar co-edited had a 15 supporting studies, really quite valuable body of work that was done. Now that we're looking at the water, energy, food nexus, a new period of modeling is starting to develop that's, I'll call it more provincial canal command in scale. And it's very exciting, trying to link water, energy, and food security in closer terms. So we see in this map prepared, and many of these maps are prepared by my colleague Afreen Siddiqui at MIT, and she's saying, well, look what's happening to the canal portion of irrigation, and that's being met by increased groundwater pumping, shown here, and as a result, you're getting some slight increase in irrigated area, but it comes at a cost. Increased energy requirements for pumping, and let's look at all these energy requirements and the consequent food production. Efreen was able to map those pumps that were using electricity and those that are diesel. Diesel is by far the more prominent type of pumping technology. And when people ask what are the differences between Punjab in India and Punjab and Pakistan, on the India side, the bulk of the pumping is electricity-based, and the electricity is subsidized. So the groundwater problems are enormously more challenging because they're dropping much more precipitously than on the Pakistan side. There's a lot to be learned on either sides of the border through some of this joint analysis. If we look at the energy intensity then of agriculture and irrigation agriculture in particular, start to be able to see how that is growing over time. More energy inputs per unit of agricultural output. And much of that is pumping and fertilizer based. The food production is increasing, albeit slowly. And although it's a small sector these days, as compared with the days of the Agro-Horticultural Society of Punjab, the yellow band of the fruits and vegetables, is got a very rapid rate of growth and great potential to this. So the horticultural sector is one to be looking at for the future, as well as the field crop sector. And so Afreen and our team has been looking at systems dynamics modeling, which would try to get to these water, energy, food relationships with one another. And again, thinking about their intersections is not just a system, but as something that can be construed as a system that's like a garden, in which adding some inputs and adjusting and substituting some of these inputs one for another for different types of outputs and different types of outcomes, different social groups, starts to be regarded as analogous to a practice of not just systems management, but gardening. Still, we think something seems to be missing. This is the last part of the talk, which goes into this idea of saying, well, what would it mean to think of the Indus Basin as a garden in the future? And so first I did try to make some summary points from the meanings of gardens as kind of being able to discern them from the Mughal through the colonial and the post-colonial 20th century period, and come out with a question or attempt to identify some of the qualities of what one means by gardens and gardening in normative terms. And so the first point is that of care. Care for the land itself, for the plants, animals, and people of the land. An expression of care for all of these living aspects of the area is central to what it means to be a gardener. There's a dignity to the labor. In those paintings of Mughal gardeners, you see these are not distressed peasants being represented. These are full-bodied, able, dignified workers mixing their labor with the land in ways that are deemed to be of high character as well as significance. There's a balance and harmony amongst the elements of a garden, a diversity of elements that need to be weighed one with another. So we might call this a struggle on the one side, but a struggle whose outcome ought to involve a balancing or weighing of the components. Any gardener will tell you about the gratitude that they feel and the gratitude they feel that ought to be part of what it means to be the steward of some land. And the patience that's required day by day, season by season, to see the fruits of a garden realized. These are good works. They're meant to be good works. They should be regarded as such, and as such they would also involve sharing with one's neighbors. If you look at the historical geography of communities that have thrived in periods of great distress, whether it be drought, floods, other types of climate variability, or other shocks, wars, civil rebellions, the communities that have a strong social structure and traditions of sharing have always endured. In the Western United States, one of the best examples are the Mormons. Their tradition of sharing the produce of their irrigation systems led them to be able to weather while many other social groups weren't. All of these have a sense of beauty, and the kind of significance of the beauty that's found in the order, diversity, composition of the landscape is of core significance. And when all of these come together as aspects of a garden, and this can be seen as a garden that is providing some signs of what prospers and why. And similarly, those gardens that have fallen away or have deteriorated or failed and have been abandoned, they too are help us to understand, well, what was missing? What did they lack? And how might it have been different? If we take these qualities of gardens and say, what's happening today that's starting to resonate with some of these idealized notion of what it means to garden and to be a gardener. And let me point to a few contemporary examples, and we'll do so with respect to the basin as a whole. So the cross-section from the mountains to the plains out to the coastal environment. And go to the upper Indus, Gilgit-Baltistan area, and look at the village waterworks and the gardens of some of the communities in that area. And you'll see all of the qualities that I've just been mentioning. At the scale of individual courtyard gardens in these village dwellings, the village itself, to array of villages along a narrow valley in the Indus gorges, thinking of the ones in the area in particular here. The irrigated gardens of the plains. I'd love to do a study in which we searched for beautiful gardens across Punjab and Sindh and found good examples of them, because I've seen so many, but I didn't take the time to geolocate them and count them and try to understand them in greater depth. But I've seen them, places where this type of care and beauty and call it humanity at its best are find full expression and find expression in the market as well. We go to, this is, folks will know this online web site, Pakistan.com, and over 300 articles in that on gardens, a whole section on horticulture, edible gardens for urban areas. And scaling up, not just in the horticulture sector, but in the food crop sector, this whole set of movements of this SRI, System of Rice Intensification. And how many know of the SRI initiatives? I don't see many hands. So I'll just mention briefly that this is a system that's come from Madagascar. It's diffusing rapidly across India and is being experimented in and has some diffusion in Pakistan now too. But very high yields with lower water input, so less water applied, fewer plants, but much greater labor in selecting those plants, planting them individually, caring and tending for them. So if it's a society that has labor as an input, then the water requirements that Rich and Mirza showed us this morning that have gone up and been associated with rice yields consistently through time. In the future, we might see a time at which rice yields are rising, but irrigation inputs are declining. It's extraordinary, and this has been achieved. People didn't believe the yield increases could be of this nature, but it's involved a care for the individual paddy fields and paddy production that's had those results, so that we don't say just labor, but also care of cultivation. Just a couple more examples of where you get extraordinarily exciting types of new science as well as technologies for delivering water to individual plants with drip irrigation and estimating the crop water requirements in more technical and detailed ways, and seeing all of the savings of money as well as resources that can be gained. So if we put this all together, and this is the final slide that I have for you, one in which there's a deeply rooted tradition of gardens, and you can't see them here, but there's a man and a woman laboring in this garden, and a bullock turning the water wheel behind that's feeding the water works of the garden. The workers here, and then on the other side, a man and a woman enjoying this garden. This, I think, we find and can find ways to expand and to replicate throughout the Indus Basin. I think that some of the works that's underway at the Water Informatics and Technology Center at LUMS, which is showing just how some of these precision deliveries of canal water can be linked with the new precision land leveling efforts of the Department of Agriculture and the other types of, call it rural development, agricultural, nutritional, food security efforts in the region, can all be connected with one another in a new era of gardens, one in which cities are also actively participating by delivering treated wastewater for the horticulture sector outside of metropolitan areas like Lahore. You can't find any better way to summarize this than through paraphrasing Abu Bakr Muhammad's passage saying, imagine how a gardener meticulously takes care of plants, and such attention to detail on a vast basin-wide scale is possible. With water informatics and related technologies, and we can add to that, and the values, policies, and politics that support it. Thanks very much. That's what I hope to share.